Let's talk about the 19th century and some of the issues that arose in the 19th century because of the way men and women were treated and exerted their influence. The men exerted their influence through control, and we call that imperialism. This was the time when empires were built all over the world. They began with scientific expeditions, and that gave rise to other countries. Some of the most important of those scientific expeditions were by people like Captain Cook, who sailed the South Pacific, discovered many of the islands, and claimed those islands in many cases for Great Britain. Another method of imperialism was use of the Industrial Revolution. The reason was there was a desire for captive markets, and therefore colonies were established principally as raw material suppliers and then as customers for the manufactured goods from the home country. There was also a concept called social Darwinism. Now, we haven't talked about Darwin yet in this course. We will do that in a later lecture. But Darwinism is really survival of the fittest in this sense. And social Darwinism means that one society will survive where others are not going to survive, or at least they become dominated by the stronger society. Europeans in the 19th century strongly believed in social Darwinism, and they saw themselves at the top of the heap. They believed that it was their scientific and inevitable right to dominate lesser educated, poor, backward countries, their view. Therefore, there was no moral indignation that Europeans would take over control of a colony and dominate it. Later, of course, that moral indignation did arise, but at least predominantly there was this social Darwinism that justified the formation of empires. We could say then that there were three major reasons that empires were formed. The first was gold, that is a monetary reason. The second was glory, that is the building up of an empire, either because the people believe that it's their inevitable right or because they think that it is the best thing. And third is God. The Europeans believed that they had a right and obligation to share their religious beliefs with people throughout the world. Let's go back a little bit to some of the early days of empire and take a look at this map and realize what the slave trade was all about. To describe it briefly, slaves were picked up on the west coast of Africa and they were transported to the New World. Brazil and the Caribbean islands were the principal places where they were taken, but the southern states in the United States and other countries as well were certainly locations. There was a similar slave trade out of Mozambique on the eastern shore, and that slave trade dealt mostly with Arabia. Nevertheless, the slaves that we are most concerned with in our story today are those out of the west coast of Africa. When the slaves went over to the Americas, then they would work in plantations, and the goods of the plantations, largely sugar or molasses that the sugar was converted into, or perhaps rum that the molasses was converted into, those would be traded back to Great Britain as well as some other products from the plantations like cotton. Then Great Britain would convert them into finished goods, and they would send them back to the Americas, or perhaps use them to purchase things in Africa, like more slaves. Eventually, Great Britain realized that slavery was abominable. They decided within Great Britain that they would stop it. Not only would they stop it within Great Britain, but they would attempt to stop it throughout the world. They saw that they needed to stop it in at least two stages. The first stage was to stop the transporting and selling of slaves in slave markets. The second was to free all of the slaves already owned in the hands of the slave owners. The first step was largely accomplished by 1850. Even in the United States, the presence of slave auctions was largely something of the past. Nevertheless, there was a place in the Americas that was still a very strong slave trading state, and that was Brazil. Great Britain was infuriated that Brazil would not listen to them. Brazil said, "We're a separate foreign sovereign country, and we don't need to buckle under to what you say, Great Britain." Great Britain said, "This is a moral issue. You must change the way you are acting because of moral purpose." Eventually, Great Britain threatened to blockade all of the Brazilian ports. And because Great Britain was by far the most powerful sea country in the world, they were able to carry out that blockade. It didn't take very long until Brazil capitulated to Great Britain's demands and they ceased the trade in slaves. There was only one major place remaining where slaves were being traded, and that was in Zanzibar on the east coast of Africa. Great Britain sailed their ships over to Zanzibar, and they pointed their cannons at the city and threatened to destroy the capital if the slave trade was not halted. Again, Great Britain's power and force dominated. We have a question then that arises. Did Britain have the right to enforce their opinion of moral values? Were these values merely British or merely Western? Does any country have the right to force its private opinions on other countries that may differ? We could say it in a different way. Is there a country that should be the policeman of the world? Let's ask ourselves, what about America's involvement in Iraq? Did they go there for moral reasons? Did they go there because they saw a dictator who needed to be removed? Certainly. Is it America's right to do that kind of thing? Now, that's a very different problem, and I think one that we ought to consider in great depth. Let me give you two of many different views on this problem. One view is the view of the French president Jacques Chirac, who was the president at the time of the United States invasion of Iraq. And Jacques Chirac said, "Any community with only one dominant power is always a dangerous one. That's why I favor a multipolar world in which Europe obviously has its place." Chirac is simply saying that America should not be the dominant, should not be the only decision maker, but that Europe, which has a wealth of experience, should be consulted in making those decisions. Chirac, of course, believed that Europe should probably have veto power over what America did. America has been, in general, reluctant to allow anyone to dictate to it what its foreign policy should be. On the other side, let's read what President Benson said about the role of those who know the truth. "Too long have too many Americans and the people of the free world generally stood by as silent accessories to the crimes of assault against freedom. Assault against basic economic and spiritual principles that have made nations strong." President Benson believes, therefore, that as members of the human race, we should be defenders of those principles that we know to be God-given: freedom, economic freedom, political freedom, and the ability to dictate one's own way. Should there be a policeman in the world? An interesting and difficult decision. If the policeman is an agent of subjugation, the answer is probably no. If the policeman is an agent of protection, perhaps the answer is a limited yes. And therefore we need to decide what will be the role of the United States as we continue to emerge as the sole dominant military force in the world. Are we the sole dominant economic force? I doubt it. Are we the sole dominant political force? I doubt it. Are we the sole dominant moral force? I doubt it. So we probably should look very carefully at what role we see as being a policeman and then act accordingly. Should one country or people take that role? Ideally, it would be a role that is favored by all people who are of good minds and believe in truth. Perhaps the role of the policeman is really the role of consensus builder, to bring together diverse people with a common purpose of enhancing humanity. Well, during the 1800s and 1900s, Great Britain had the role that America now has. And Great Britain's role was the empire. They ruled, for instance, India. It was considered to be the crown, the jewel of the English crown. Initially, India was ruled by a large number of local kings called Maharajas. And these were all coordinated for economic purposes by the British East India Company. British East India Company would go and purchase goods from each of the princes and then sell those goods in a world market. Eventually, the princes started to fight with each other. They continued to fight with each other, and as they did that, they disrupted the markets. And as they disrupted the markets, the profits fell and the problems rose. Therefore, the British East India Company called for support of the British Army, which was freely given. And the British Army then walked in where Maharajas were fighting, and they quelled the fighting, and by so doing took control over each of the territories that the Maharajas controlled. Little by little, Great Britain got control over all of India, sometimes leaving Maharajas in place and sometimes removing them and replacing them with a British appointee. In 1858, all of India was officially declared to be part of the British Empire. Queen Victoria went to Bombay, where she was given the crown of the Empress, and that was done in India. Let's talk about British power as it was exerted in China during the same period. China had always been isolationist, big enough that it didn't really need the rest of the world, and so far away from Europe that it didn't have much contact with the rest of the world. But as exploration increased in the 17 and early 1800s, China was seen as a tremendous market. They did, after all, have a huge population, and it looked to the English merchants like a wonderful place that could buy manufactured goods from Great Britain. But China resisted. They did not want to be westernized. They did not want to become a consumer society. They wanted to maintain their own traditions and stay separate. But the Europeans, especially Great Britain, but others as well, pushed hard for trade concessions with China, insisting that there were things that the Westerners had that the Chinese would inevitably want, and vice versa. Well, China eventually caved in and gave Canton, now called Guangzhou, as a port for use of foreign nations in trade. The British imported tea and silk and porcelain, but interestingly enough, there were very few manufactured goods in Great Britain that the Chinese wanted to buy. Then Great Britain realized that they had under their control from India a commodity that the Chinese were anxious to get, and it was opium. Opium, of course, is a drug that is related to heroin. And opium was illegal in China. Nevertheless, Great Britain began to carry it from India into Guangzhou and then distribute it throughout China. They had large warehouses full of opium in Guangzhou because they tried to even out the supply and not worry about crop growth and problems at sea in the transportation of this commodity. The Chinese government stiffened their resistance to the importing of this illegal product, and probably with some government support, a group of Chinese nationalists burned down the factories, the warehouses for the opium that belonged to the Brits. Great Britain was angry. They claimed that they had been unfairly treated, that their private property had been destroyed. Ignore the fact that it was all illegal. And therefore, 2 wars were fought, one in 1839 and again in 1856. They're called the Opium Wars. And in these wars, Great Britain forced China to accept illegal opium, to open their doors to illegal opium. And even though it was bad for the people, it was good for business. And therefore, Great Britain pushed it. Now, this is not the best time for Great Britain from a moral standpoint. As a result of these wars, Hong Kong, a city not too far away from Guangzhou, was actually ceded to Great Britain for 99 years. And we have had just fairly recently the return of Hong Kong to China. There was also a rebellion in 1899 called the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were an ethnic group in China, and they resisted the encroachment of European countries into China. They tried to drive out the Europeans and were defeated by the European armies. So as we can see, the Europeans simply forced their way into China. At about the same time, America forced their way into Japan, using the power of the American Navy as the wedge to open up Japan to trade. Well, let's talk now about the 2 countries of Europe that had not become powers. The reason is that Italy and Germany were divided into various groups. Let's talk about Italy first. Italy had always been a patchwork of small states, divided more or less into 3 major sections. The northern part of Italy was under the domination of the Austrians, or prior to the Austrian domination by the Holy Roman Emperor, a German. The middle part of Italy was called the Papal States, and though nominally under control of the Pope, the Papal States were really a series of mostly independent principalities. The southern part of Italy, called by various names like the states of Naples or Naples and Sicily, were controlled by various groups. Early on, they were controlled by the Vikings. Later, they were controlled by the Muslims. And then after that, they were controlled by the Spanish, and then eventually by the French, and then by the Spanish again, and back and forth. Well, in 1859, the Austrians decided that they were going to assert their control ever more stringently over northern Italy. There was a prime minister of the King of Sardinia who wanted to unite northern Italy with Sardinia under the control of the king. And this prime minister was a superb diplomat. He went to Emperor Napoleon III in France, and solicited his support. He said, if you will come and support the Italians against the Austrians, we will make it worth your while. And they negotiated, and making it worth his while meant that the Italians gave up Savoy as their property, so it became part of France. Savoy is the area around the French Riviera, the city of Cannes and Nice. Well, with that guarantee, Napoleon III sent troops into northern Italy and guaranteed the existence of northern Italy and drove out the Austrians with, of course, Italian support. So northern Italy became part of the Kingdom of Italy and Sardinia, and it became declared as the Kingdom of Italy. But remember, it was only northern. At about this same time, a rebel leader in Sicily started to assemble a group of soldiers that were dressed with red shirts, and he called them the Red Shirts. They came from Sicily and eventually took Naples, and then from Naples they marched northward until they came to the outskirts of Rome. When they got to the outskirts of Rome, the Red Shirt Army under their leader Garibaldi had a decision to make. They could enter Rome and take it as a possession for them, but if they did that, they understood that they would be facing the army of northern Italy. In other words, there would be a civil war. Or Garibaldi could stop his progress and not invade Rome, but then invade it together with the army of northern Italy in a cooperative way, thus taking the Pope's land away from him and combining it into the rest of Italy. Garibaldi decided that he would recognize the king of northern Italy. He would give all of his territory, that is the southern part of Italy, to the king, and they would declare it to be a unified country, and the Pope would lose all of his territory. The Pope was furious, but having no army, he was unable to resist this invasion. For many, many years, the Pope would fail to recognize the existence of the Kingdom of Italy. Eventually, however, a compromise was struck. A new Pope came in, and he recognized the inevitability of the existence of the country or Kingdom of Italy, and therefore he agreed that he would accept as a sovereign territory the Vatican, where he could be the ruler, and it would not be part of Italy or part of Rome or anything else. It would be a Catholic enclave completely surrounded by the rest of Italy. And that's exactly the situation that we have today. Vatican City is a separate country with its own post office, its own army, the Swiss Guards, and its own ruling bureaucracy. Very small, of course. Well, Italy became a country then in the mid-1800s. Let's talk about Germany. Germany also, from the days of the Middle Ages, was a series of small principalities. There were over 300 of them at certain stages, and then, little by little, the numbers were decreased until at the time of Napoleon's conquest of Germany, he assembled them down to a group of about 20, and he confederated them. It was called the Confederation of the Rhine, and he administered them as a single unit. That may have been the critical impetus for the formation of unified Germany. Nevertheless, after Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna gathered together and they decided to go back to the way it was before Napoleon, and that meant that each of these 20 states would be reestablished as an independent kingdom. But one of those kingdoms was more powerful than all of the others. That kingdom was Prussia. It had been actually excluded from the group of 20 because of its size and importance. It had been administered as a separate territory under Napoleon, and it was largely responsible for the defeat of Napoleon along with Great Britain. Therefore, Prussia started to assume its position as leader of all of the German-speaking states. Eventually, a man named Otto von Bismarck became prime minister under the ruler of Germany. The ruler was an emperor. And Otto von Bismarck, through very clever political manipulations and threats, he was able to create a unified Germany. One of the last steps that he did in this creation of a unified Germany was to force a war on France, the Franco-Prussian War, fought in the 1870s. And in that war, all of the German states, except for Austria, joined together in combat against France, and they defeated France quite handily. Took about less than a year. And when that was done, it was a natural step then for all of the German states to be brought into a single country. And they were brought into that country, into that state under their emperor, who was called a Kaiser. Kaiser being the word for Caesar, which of course is associated with empires. Well, the old Kaiser died, and a new Kaiser, Wilhelm II, came into power. He was an aggressive young man who didn't like old-fashioned Bismarck, and he dismissed Otto von Bismarck. The new Kaiser started to have a very aggressive policy both in foreign affairs and within Europe. The Kaiser's new policies of aggressiveness eventually led to World War I, but we'll talk about that in a separate lecture. Therefore, this period where Germany had organized itself together into an empire was called the Second Reich, or Second Empire, the first one being the Holy Roman Empire. Now Germany saw itself as a Second Reich. Just a word of note, when Hitler rose, he believed that he was going to create a Third Reich, a third empire under German power. So here we see a map of the world listing all of the colonial attachments. And you can see that there are large French and English areas, some large independent areas like South America that had been able to, by this time, break away from Spain and Portugal. And of course, Russia was independent. But from this map, you can see that much of Africa and many other states in the world had been brought into colonial status. Well, that's the man's side of the 19th century. Let's talk about the woman's side. The woman's side in the 19th century was dictated primarily by a single woman. That was Queen Victoria. She came to the crown as a very young woman, and she lived for a very long time. And during that period of time, England rose to the pinnacle of power that we have discussed. It was, in fact, an empire that stretched through nearly every time zone, thus leading to the statement, "The sun never sets on the British Empire." Queen Victoria was also the prototype of the perfect mother. She loved her children, she loved her husband. They were all devoted to each other in both outward and inward ways. If you've seen some of the movie of young Victoria, you will see that she didn't start her marriage that way, but eventually she grew to love her husband, Albert, and of course she loved her children dearly. Poor Victoria lost Albert when he was in the prime of life. From that moment on, she became the grieving widow. She dressed in black and was always in mourning. It was a very sad thing for Great Britain, a sad thing for Victoria herself. But she became the better half, if you like, or that person who is identified as the epitome of women throughout this period. Women were viewed as being better than men, and they needed to be protected because they were better than men. That attitude resulted in fact a lowering of women's position and a lowering of women's power and a subjugation of women to men. It's a bit ironic that it was always considered that women were better and yet they became inferior. At the time of Victoria, she was very powerful, but when she went into mourning especially, she turned over much of the power of government to her prime ministers. And there were two of them principally, a man named Gladstone and a man named Disraeli. They were rivals, one a Liberal and the other a Tory. It's interesting what one woman said about the attitude of these two men. It shows them from a woman's perspective. And here's what she said. When I left the dining room after sitting next to Mr. Gladstone, I thought he was the cleverest man in England. But after sitting next to Mr. Disraeli, I thought I was the cleverest woman in England. Very, very interesting difference between those two. Do you agree with the Victorian concept of a woman's role? Was she better than a man? Do you think that she needed to be protected? Or are the independent rights of a woman greater or more compelling than being protected? Remember, of course, that the protection inevitably led to a subjugation. That's part of the problem, isn't it? That subjugation was addressed by a playwright named Henrik Ibsen. He was a Norwegian. Very powerful play called The Doll's House. And in this play, he talks about a woman named Nora. Nora has a pretty standard life. She's married to a man named Torvald, and she tries to do a little nice favor for him and realizes that she needs to borrow a little money to do it. She borrows the money and then has some difficulty repaying it. There's a minor embarrassment, but nothing too serious. But Torvald is shocked, and he's shocked because he sees his wife moving without him, moving without his authority, and potentially embarrassing him. Therefore, he criticizes her severely. In the midst of that criticism, he is confronted with a surprising rise in indignation from Nora, and in fact, she says that she is going to simply leave him. Let's read the final scene where we get a feeling for this confrontation between Helmer Torvald and his wife Nora. Helmer says, "What madness this is! Oh, your blind inexperience!" Nora, "I must try to gain experience, Torvald." Helmer, "To forsake your home, your husband, and your children, and you don't consider what the world will say?" Nora, "I can pay no heed to that. I only know what I must do, that I must do it." Helmer, "This is monstrous. Can you forsake your holiest duties in this way?" Notice that he's now bringing in religion as something that she should consider. Nora, "What do you consider my holiest duties?" Helmer, "Do I need to tell you that? Your duties to your husband and your children. I have other duties equally sacred." Impossible. What duties do you mean? My duties toward myself. Before all else, you are a wife and a mother. That I no longer believe. I believe that before all else, I am a human being, just as much as you are, or at least that I should try to become one. Are you not clear about your place in your own home? Have you not an infallible guide in questions like these? Have you not religion? Oh, Torvald, I don't really know what religion is. What do you mean? I know nothing but what Pastor Hansen told me when I was confirmed. He explained that religion was this and that. When I get away from all this and stand alone, I will look into that matter too. I will see whether what he taught me is right, or at any rate, whether it is right for me. Oh, this is unheard of, and from so young a woman. But if religion cannot keep you right, let me appeal to your conscience, for I suppose you have some moral feeling, or answer me. Perhaps you have none. Must I always be a stranger to you? Nora, taking her traveling bag. Yes, unless it were to happen, the most wonderful thing of all, What? Unless we both could change so that, oh, Torvald, I no longer believe in miracles, you see. Tell me, let me believe, unless we could change so that our life together might be truly a marriage. Goodbye. Helmer sinks into a chair by the door with his face in his hands. Nora, Nora. He looks around the room and rises. She is gone. How empty it all seems. A hope springs within him. The most wonderful thing of all. And then the play ends. Why was A Doll's House so radical? What do you think caused the tremendous uproar in not only Norway but throughout the Western world because of this play? It's because Nora was a good person, and yet she couldn't stand the type of marriage that she was living in. And that marriage was all too common among the people of the world. Yes, a woman's rights needed to be risen. There were other writers who also addressed women's rights in a very subtle and sometimes direct way. Little Women by Louisa May Alcott was a story of a strong-willed young woman who demonstrates her ability to survive in the world. Emily Dickinson was a wonderful poetess, a recluse, really, living alone in seclusion in Massachusetts. She wrote 1,700 poems, and only 7 were published during her life. She talked about the interaction between herself and the world, and as a very shy and lonely person, that interaction was very revealing for women who felt isolated from the world in general. The women's suffrage movement, that is to get the vote, began in the Victorian age when men's suffrage became quite widespread. Women throughout Europe and America began to demonstrate for their right to vote. Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein, she was one of the foremost leaders of this movement in Great Britain. In the United States, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were powerful leaders. Eventually, in 1920, the 19th Amendment was enacted, guaranteeing the right for women to vote in all of the elections. In 1972, an Equal Rights Amendment was passed in Congress. This was a change in the Constitution that would guarantee women totally and absolute equal rights with men. The difficulty is that the way it was written would eliminate the differences between men and women, and surely there are some. Therefore, because of this logical resistance to an Equal Rights Amendment, the states refused to ratify the amendment within the required time. The United States, therefore, does not have an Equal Rights Amendment to this day. Nevertheless, many of the issues raised during the debate over the Equal Rights Amendment have been enacted into law. You might ask yourself this interesting question: why did the LDS Church oppose the Equal Rights Amendment? I think the answer to that is because it refused, the amendment refused to recognize the difference between men and women. The LDS Church believes that there are differences, not only physically but emotionally and perhaps in role. And they articulated those in their proclamation on the family. If the Equal Rights Amendment would have been enacted, some of those differences might have been impossible legally. Therefore, I think the position of the church was, we are against the amendment, but we are in favor of reducing the discrimination against women wherever it occurs. And that's largely the case. Another issue of women's rights, if you like, arose with Roe versus Wade in 1973, in which abortion, or the right of a woman to obtain an abortion, was upheld by the Supreme Court. There are large groups, largely religious in nature, that are opposed to this finding of the Supreme Court, and they want to write a constitutional amendment to overturn it. They call it the Abortion Amendment. There are others, women's rights advocates, who say a woman has a right to her own body, and until that child is born, it is part of the woman's body, and therefore the woman has a right to determine whether or not the child will live. The LDS Church has taken a very powerful and, I think, enlightened stance. They are opposed to abortion, except in extreme cases such as rape or incest. And therefore, the Church has made it very, very clear that abortion is wrong. And they have advocated a strong educational system of teaching fidelity in marriage and chastity before marriage. Nevertheless, if an unwanted pregnancy is realized, the Church has indicated that the preferred method of handling that would be through adoption rather than abortion. And therefore the Church has set up an extensive, perhaps one of the best in the world, adoption systems. So I like what the Church has done. They have recognized the inevitability of abortion. Even if there were a constitutional amendment against it, there would be women who still go out and seek abortions. And yet the Church has done an education system and has taken a position of protection of the baby through adoption. You might ask yourself, do women have equal rights today, or are there still some areas of discrimination? Many women point to a discrepancy in salaries, and they say that that demonstrates a continuation of discrimination. And yet, that may be so. And yet I can see that little by little women are gaining positions of leadership in companies, and therefore I would guess that over the next few years that difference in salaries will be eliminated. You might ask yourself, do women have equal opportunities today? Certainly they do legally. Now, you might wonder whether they have those equal opportunities in actual fact. I think that in general they do. Today in universities, and BYU is no exception, there are more women attending universities than there are men. That indicates perhaps that women are being given equal opportunities. Thank you very much. Appreciate your discussion, your listening to this discussion today. Bye-bye.